Hi, everybody. It's Liz Gilbert. Hello, hello. We are going to be talking tonight with the amazing Ayana Mathis about her book, The Unsettled, here on the Onward Book Club. Hi, everybody. It is so good to see you. I'm going to send her an invite and then we're going to get on the road here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for hopping on. See how this goes. We did a couple practice rounds earlier. It's good to see you all. I'm going to be a little more subdued in my voice than I normally am. Do you hear my subdued voice?
Your voice is subdued.
Yes, it's extremely subdued because I'm trying to not bring on a bronchial coughing fit whilst at the same time dying with excitement to talk to you. I'm not allowed to laugh. I'm not allowed to emote, but I want to do all of these
I'll be very serious.
We'll be very serious. Hello, everybody. Welcome.
Hello.
I
was being very serious.
I just am so excited, everyone. Welcome to the Onward Book Club. This is the most interstellarly magnificent novel. I can't wait to talk about it. We're talking tonight about The Unsettled by Ayana Mathis. I'm going to turn off the comments so that we can focus on each other. And if you all don't just mind sending up heaps of love for this extraordinary author who is honoring us with her presence tonight. So, got to figure out how to turn off the comments every single time I do this. It's like it's the first time.
I know, right?
And, oh my Lord, there's only so many buttons. Wait, is there a button up here? Turn off commenting. There we go. Okay. Now it's just us and several hundred people.
Thank you
Hello.
for having me. Hi. Hi. I can't believe. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to talk about this book. This book is so beautiful, and I'm going to introduce you. This is a custom that we have on the Onward Book Club, is to give an honoring introduction to our guest. And so here is what we have to honor you with. Ayana Mathis is a genius. That's a good start for an introduction, which you already know.
Wow.
Yep, well, it's true. If you've read The Unsettled, the book we are here tonight to celebrate and dig into, you would also know this if you, like untold bagrillions of other people, have read her debut novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, which placed her in the pantheon of great American storytellers. And also, I want to say, is one of those books that hit this intersection between critically adored and publicly adored, which is not a very easy intersection to land on. It was revered by critics and it was loved by the people at the same time. It's so good. And like this book garnered all the awards, I already cannot wait to read your next one, no pressure. She has a gift for telling important, big, multi-generational historic stories on a deeply human scale and for creating characters who break our hearts in the best of ways. For instance, Toussaint, the boy in this story, will stay with me forever, and I don't think I will really be able to sleep until you assure me that he is finally safe. When she is not writing brilliant novels, Ayana teaches creative writing at Hunter College in New York City. She received her MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and went on to become the first African-American woman to serve as an assistant professor in that program. Yes. She also writes nonfiction, which appears in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and elsewhere. She is a frequent book reviewer for The New York Times, and she is currently pursuing her Master's of Divinity. This novel, The Unsettled, and so aptly titled, was named a Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, Oprah Daily, and me. And I am thrilled. I am so thrilled that this book has brought you to us. Welcome to the Onward Book Club. We are so happy to receive you.
That was a very honoring introduction. My goodness. Thank you. And thank you for having me here. This is so wonderful. Thank you.
It is so wonderful. I want to begin with place. And then I want to get into people. You have set this book in Philadelphia, as you did with your debut novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie. I lived in Philadelphia for quite a long time. Spent a lot of my career there. I did. I worked at the American Diner on 42nd and Chestnut Street. Anyway, I lived in West Philly, not far from Osage Avenue, not far from where the move bombing was. I have Philadelphia is a very particular place. You grew up in Philadelphia. You continue to choose to explore it. For those of you who don't know Philadelphia, it's a particular thing. It's not New York. It's not Washington, D.C. It's not Baltimore. It's often defined by what it isn't. And I wondered if, as we begin, you could talk about why you continue to called to write about this place and what it is to you that brings you back to Philadelphia again with this novel.
I mean, it's so I make a joke that my family is 100 years of Philly, which is actually true. But my grandparents got there in the 20s, so 1920s. And a lot of people have left and dispersed, myself included. I live in New York now. I haven't lived in Philly a long time, but it's core to my identity, I think, or any sort of understanding of who I am or what I am. And my mother lived in Philadelphia all of her life, more or less. Most of my aunts and other people did too. So it's very close to the bone, just as a place, because I grew up there and there's such a long history of my family there. But it's also, I mean, well put, it's kind of defined by what it isn't. And I think that's because it gets sort of sandwiched in these Atlantic, sort of East Coast seaboard cities, and everyone kind of forgets that it's there, sort of. What's that?
The Amtrak cities.
Exactly, all the Amtrak cities. I don't know, now people remember more because of things like Mayor of Easttown or something, but that's a very different kind of Philadelphia. I think it also it has a very, very long history. Obviously, it was sort of one of the first cities. It has a very long history for Black people. It was of such interest that W.E.B. Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro is sort of a tome about the Philadelphia Negro, written in the early 20th century. It's a deeply enigmatic city. It's sort of, it's kind of mysterious even to me, I think, or maybe especially to me because I'm from there. I don't know. It's pretty much an angry city. It's gentrified heavily in the last year. So it's sort of, people are kind of trying to present this kinder, gentler face, but really Philly is just still a bit seething,
Yeah.
It's super segregated in most ways. Like, it's deeply racially segregated. It's super class segregated. It has this kind of long, illustrious middle class and upper class for all races, really. And the segregation between those classes in all races is it's really stratified. And it's always having these sort of, it's kind of bumping up against, there's a lot of class friction. But the weird thing about Philly, I think in particular, are two things. One, it is one of the least self-reflective places that I have ever heard of, right? Like, it is not interested in airing its dirty laundry. It is not interested in plumbing its own depths. That is none of your damn business. Like, that's sort of how it,
Wow.
That's kind of how it rolls. And it is also one of the proudest cities that I have ever encountered. And in a very different way than New York is proud or other places, Philadelphia is extraordinarily proud of its Philadelphia-ness and even of its secrecy and of its kind of dirty laundry and of its privacy. It's a really private place. It took me many years to understand that some of the more enigmatic parts of my own mother were because she's a Philadelphian.
Wow.
Like, in addition to her own personality.
Oh, that's amazing.
Like,
So it's not just that she's like this. It's like she was born out of this. It's in the groundwater. It's in her bone marrow to be this particular thing.
It really was. Yeah. And some of it's her own personality and proclivities and all that kind of stuff. But some of it, many, many, many years later, I was like, oh, this is also her Philadelphianness that leads to some of these things. So it's a very fertile place. And what I'm writing about in many ways is a Philadelphia of the mind, right? Like, this book, The Unsettled, is set in the 1980s, and that Philadelphia doesn't exist anymore. Although some of its traits do, because like many places that are stubborn, it's not that interested in changing,
right.
But in any case, so it's a Philadelphia of the mind and of the imagination and of memory and of these kinds of formative truths about my own life and about Black life, or an iteration thereof, that I think remain true, even if they don't exactly exist in that form anymore.
What an incredibly fertile answer. I love that. And it gave me context for the part of my own life that I lived there. And I found it to be such a puzzling city. And I also always felt so unsafe in Philadelphia in a way that I have never felt anywhere else that I've ever lived. Like I didn't feel that unsafe in Calcutta. I didn't feel that unsafe in, in New York in the early 90s. I was like, man, this place is on edge is the way that it always felt. I made up a word when I lived in Philly called Brinksy. Like everything felt like it was on the brinks. And for that reason, and people felt Brinksy and the neighborhoods felt, and the reason I wanted to start with that is because this is a Brinksy book, like people are on the brink in this book, and the three characters who, I mean, there are other characters and they're all extraordinary, but the three characters interrelated who we're talking about here, it's a grandmother, Dutchess, estranged from her daughter, Ava, who is struggling to raise her son, Toussaint. And they are the most extraordinary characters. Each one so fully actualized and so fully realized, and each one Brinksy in their own way, while also surrounded by so much danger and instability. I felt like I didn't really take a breath when I was reading this book from the very beginning. And I don't want to put you on the spot because I didn't warn you about this, but do you have a copy of it? I was going to ask you if you could just read the prologue.
I do.
Great.
I would be happy to. And I'll show everybody too. Liz has the gorgeous hardcover, and this is the paperback.
See the multitude of choices you have to buy this. You can decide which one you like.
Exactly. Choose your own adventure type of situation. All right, so I'm going to read the prologue. There's nothing you need to know because it's the prologue.
That's why I love starting with the beginning.
Toussaint Wright stepped onto Ephraim Avenue with a backpack slung over his shoulder and a bleeding cut on his cheek. He was 13 years old. 2 years before, a fire had consumed 248 Ephraim Avenue, where Toussaint used to live. The fire destroyed most everything he loved. Nothing remained but a few girders inside the charred hull of the house and a scorched old oak tree out front. Toussaint had passed through many homes since then, group homes and foster homes, the rectory of a pastor he knew, but he always busted out of them. Now he stood a long time on Ephraim, watching browned leaves falling from the oak. The gutter pipe on 248 came loose and bent with a metallic shriek that sent a flock of sparrows flying off into the night. Toussaint had not eaten in 2 days. He had run most of the way there, stopping to catch his breath behind parked cars or in alleys. His heart was beating too fast. His blood ran like water. He touched his hand to the cut on his cheek and felt something small and hard protruding. Glass. Earlier, in another part of the city, some boys who hung around the same corner Toussaint had been hanging around had asked him a couple of questions. Why you always alone? And why you don't ever talk? You ain't got no mama or a grandmama or something? The answer to these questions were unbearable. Sometimes grief came on him like a sweeping numbness, up from his toes and along his neck so he couldn't swallow. Other times, it was a column of rage rising along his spine. In answer to the boy's questions, he picked up a brick. He picked up a brick and threw it through the glass window of an abandoned storefront on the corner. Then he ran. Now, on Ephraim, he stomped his feet to warm himself. His sneakers thudded against the asphalt. The sound rang in the cold, empty air, so he stomped again, harder this time. The block was all shadows, as though the night was more night there than anywhere else. He pried off a piece of plywood nailed over the doorway of 248. This took the last of his strength. He ducked through the opening he'd made and entered the house. Yo, 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 he called, just to hear his voice echo down the hallway. Toussaint settled in the warmest corner with a blanket, a sandwich he'd taken off a passed-out drunk, and a sheaf of letters from his mother, who wrote to him every week from Holmesburg prison, even though he couldn't stand to go and see her. He had letters from his grandmother, too. Her name was Dutchess. She lived in a place called Bonaparte in Alabama. He was on his way there. He was really going this time. Toussaint fell into a jerky, shivering sleep and dreamed of throwing the brick through the window all over again. Filaments of glass caught in the street light glowed as they fell. The glass rain sparkled like tinsel.
Mm. And that's the beginning, right? Like and in many ways the book, I feel, is an attempt to answer the questions that the boys on the corner are asking this hungry, alone child. Why don't you have a mother? Why don't you have a grandmother? Why don't you speak? Essentially, what happened to you? And unlike your family of origin, Toussaint's family is not third generation Philadelphian. This is a family that came as part of the, that has been unsettled. Well, has been unsettled, but also settled. It's tricky. They're a funny combination of roaming and then deeply committed to whatever bit of land they can get and hold on to. I want to start with Duchess because writer to writer, I have a question for you, and it's an instinct and an intuition that I have to ask you. Did you invent her, or did she show up?
She showed up.
Knew it.
She showed up.
I knew it.
Showed up. She was a real gift. There was nothing I could do with that lady. She just showed up, and she showed up honestly before I even knew what to do with her. Like, I didn't know sort of where there's a in the second half of the book. For folks who are listening, she's a kind of itinerant blues singer. Formerly, when we meet her, she's in her 70s. She cusses. She drinks whiskey from a jelly jar. She carries a gun around. She got a big dog named Delilah. That's
she uses the gun.
Yeah,
I just want to say, is not afraid to use the gun and shoot people with it whenever necessary. She's an amazing character.
She's astounding, and she showed up. She's Southern, and she showed up in a story like that I knew was part of something. She tells about a flood she was caught in, when one of these historic floods of the Mississippi in the 1920s. She tells the story,
right,
and it's all in her voice, and that was how she showed up. And I was like, I don't know what to do with this woman, but obviously she is here for a reason. And so then I just sort of rode around until we sort of figured out where she belonged, and she agreed to be put there, basically.
Well, she wouldn't have been in the book without her agreement. I mean, that's the thing about Duchess. Like, without her consent, I don't feel like you could have had this book. I want to get to the other characters, but I'm so excited by your answer, because I still, after all this time and all these years of writing and reading, I don't understand where these people come from. These characters who arrive and demand that their stories be told, or permit, in the case of Duchess, that her story be told by you. Do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like there's a sort of amalgam, this kind of it's like some sort of strange alchemy, right? It's like all of your experiences and the people that you loved or knew, or people that you wish you knew, and all these, and historical things and religious things, and they all keep going in and in and in and in and in, right? Like, you don't even realize you're taking this stuff in. If there are writers who are listening, especially if you're stuck or feeling discouraged, you don't even realize that this stuff is going in there, but it is. And then it kind of churns around in this kind of crucible of yourself, and somehow it kind of appears, and I don't know if she's not like any of my relatives, so I can't even say, oh, it's my aunt so-and-so speaking through, she's right. Not those people, but somehow she seems gifted by those people, like by the people that are gone now, or even some of them that are living. My mother passed in the fall, and
so sorry.
Me too. and my grandmother and all these, these people that are gone, and I don't know. Again, Duchess is not at all like any. My mother I literally never heard my mother curse, not one day in my entire life, like not even hell. So she's quite the opposite of Duchess, aside from the steeliness, I think. But yeah, I don't know. That was a long answer. I don't know where these folks come from, but they gift themselves to us now and again. And you have no control over where they'll come or when they'll come. You could sit for 10 years trying to invent one. It's not going to happen. But if you get one, then you just sort of sit and listen, I suppose.
You sit and listen. All you writers out there, you sit and listen. Yeah, I many times writing, I've actually begun the process by asking those characters, what do you want me to tell the people about you? You know, and then listening to see if they'll tell me. The next generation of character in this book is Ava, who's Duchess's daughter, who spent the very early part of her life sort of being dragged around by her itinerant blues singing, semi-successful, sometimes flush with money, other times starving in a boxcar mother, which actually, in the way Ava recalls it, doesn't sound like that bad a life.
No.
It actually kind of, you know, kids don't know. They're used to what they have. And like for her, it was what she knew, and there were things that were great about it. And perhaps because of that wild itinerant upbringing, or perhaps because it's just her nature, is a really hungry soul. That's how I felt her. A person, a deeply unsettled person, full of longing, full of desire. And you didn't make your job easy with this character, because she's complicated, and a lot of people in this book judge her, from her own mother, who has a great line that says, this kind of woman, this is her own mother talking about Ava, this kind of woman is always setting the house on fire while she's still in it, is one thing she says about her only child. Another thing she says is that Ava doesn't have the sense to come in from the cold. And you get this feeling with Ava through the book that she continually makes these decisions for her life. I'm so sympathetic to her because I've done this for a lot of my life too, running toward chaos, like running toward the thing that's actually going to unsettle you even more. And when she tries to settle, she's so miserable settled that she has to bust out of it and run toward chaos again, which would be whatever, fine, her own business, except she's got this child. And where I'm saying that you've made your job difficult as a novelist is you didn't make it easy by making Ava be a traditionally wonderful mother. You know, like, and there are times like Miss Simmons, the woman who runs the homeless family shelter where they stay for a harrowing period of the book, you know, is like so exasperated. And, you know, we're all exasperated with the bureaucracy of the poverty in this story too, but we're also like, yeah, maybe go get a job, like maybe go do something to take care of yourself. So I want to know, but on the other hand, she loves her kid. And one of the things that I think is so beautiful and complex about this book is that you show something that is so deeply real, which is how it is possible for a mother to absolutely love their child and have their child be the center of their life and still not be good at being a mother, which is many people. And so I wondered if you could speak to that and how it felt for you bringing her into life and into the page, and why you made it so hard on yourself by making her so complex.
I did not want to. I mean, this book took about a decade. And one of the reasons that it took about a decade was that damn Ava. I mean, she just went.
Oh my God, I get this.
She, you know, unlike Dutchess, who appeared and was like, all right, well, if you get it right, I'll keep showing up. Ava was like, no, I don't. You don't know me. I'm not going to make myself known. That's wrong. You know, you would get to be like 45 pages, be like, okay, maybe I've nailed her down. And she's like, no, that's not right at all. So I'm not going to talk to you anymore. You know, I mean, I was judging her, just like she's exasperating. Just like other people judge her, and she was exasperating to me. I can say one of the things that helps, those lines that you read of Duchess saying things, and Duchess is certainly by no means a perfect mother either. We'll get into it in a second, but sometimes it was helpful to me to sort of give Duchess a little bit of my exasperation, so that she could say things that needed to be said, and the reader's exasperation, and that the reader is feeling, so that then I could sort of take them off of my plate, and I could kind of look at her her, Ava, meaning, with more compassion and more fullness. It's like I needed to be able to say, like, God, why do you make such bad choices? Would you please stop doing that? You're really annoying. Why are you so self-sabotaging? You know, so I could say those things through other characters, and then which sort of would widen my own field of vision, so I wouldn't be so stuck on the ways in which I had a problem with her. But I think, you know, her mother, Duchess, also isn't easy. You know, in some ways, this novel is kind of like, I make a joke that it's sort of like mirror images, you know, like Duchess's life in Alabama and her sort of road as a parent to one child who she loves very deeply, but often fails to recognize what that child needs in the moment they need it, is kind of mirrored by what Ava does with Toussaint. You know, I mean, they're sort of in this little dance as mothers that kind of reflect one another. And that's about personality, of course, and it's about proclivity, and it's about things like that. But it's also about, I think it's also about resources, and it's also about what we mean by a good mother. You know, I mean, these are first of all, the standards of good mother are absurd, and no one meets them. No matter how much money they have, no matter how much privilege they have, no matter how, you know, you can't meet that commercial, you know, whatever.
Everybody loses on that whole thing.
Just no way, right?
Yeah.
And I think for these women in particular in this book, one of the questions that I was thinking about was what does it mean to love your children and to be unsure of what sort of legacy you can leave them? Also, what does it mean to love your children and know, not unsure, but know that your love cannot keep them safe? Both of these women know that. Like, they know that from the get-go. I can love this child with my whole heart and soul, and in fact they do, but it will not protect the hairs on their head. And they understand that. And so then the way that they mother, the choices that they make, the pressures that exerts on them creates a very different picture of what good mothering looks like, or what mothering looks like in general. And I think it's sort of asking a lot of questions about what does it look like to be a Black mother? What does it look like to be a woman who is poor, who is mothering? Beyond the usual questions about resources and things like that, but also these like psychic pressures, like I can't keep this kid safe, or everybody wants to leave their children something. What can I leave them? What will it look like? How do I protect it? If it's not material, could it be something else? Like, what, you know, these are basic questions I think about having and raising children are ones that these women both are kind of grappling with, and that the book is grappling with.
There's a line that I loved, where Ava is reflecting on her own mothering of her child and says, when you're somebody's mother, you can't admit that you can't manage the mothering. You can't say, I am pulled under by a heavy love. What a line. I am pulled under by a heavy love, me and him, and drowning in it. That line, it's so humanizing and heartbreaking to her that she can be both loving this child and drowning in this love, and bound to him, and stuck with him, and desperate for him to be well and not knowing how. I mean, a large part of this too is that these men leave, you know, and it reminded me of an old line in a blues song that said, when a man gets the blues, he grabs a train and rides. When a woman gets the blues, she hangs her head and cries. She can't grab a train and ride because she's got the kids. You know, she can't leave them. And these men leave. And these fathers leave, and these women are left with these children who they're drowning in and loving. And then what makes it even worse in this book is that he comes back. You know, like, it's like the father of this child, Cass, who does the worst thing he can do, which is to leave, turns out not the worst thing he can do. The most
It's sort of like you wish he'd stayed gone.
Oh my God.
I don't want to spoiler, but yeah, it's like, that would have been better if you just sort of.
When he comes back, my entire nervous system was like, no. Like because they're almost, it's like they're almost out, and like he's just at the last minute he comes back, which is incredible storytelling. I mean, this whole book is so suspenseful. And you know, I mean, I read it in one gasp because I couldn't not know. I had to make sure that everybody was okay, you know, and especially when he appeared. And he's a fascinating character. I had a lot of thoughts about Cass. He's the love of Ava's life, and love is maybe not even the right word. The addiction of Ava's life. I mean, he is the provider of what she's been looking for, which is this tremendous excitement. And he reminds me of a man who I once loved, who a therapist friend of mine said, what you have to understand about this man, Liz, is he's not a man. He's a type of man.
Cass is absolutely a type of man. That's amazing.
He's a type of man. Watch out, you know, and it's this incredibly charismatic, incredibly sexy. So many times in the book when you're describing Cass, you know, he's literally glinting with gold, you know, like he's gleaming, he's shining, you call him out, like he's radiant with amber, like you use all this like precious, he's so vivid, and he's such a great speaker, and he's so sexy, and he has the nerve. I love the line where it's like he also has the nerve to be a doctor, you know, like as if that's not enough, you know. And it also reminds me of a friend who loved a man like that, who said, I took one look at that man and said I would follow him all the way to hell, and then I did. Right? So Ava would follow this man all the way to hell, and then she did. And because you are such a complex novelist, I'm also kind of pulling for him in this book, because he's also a revolutionary and a visionary whose ideas about Black community building are accurate and compelling and heartbreaking and beautiful. And you see why he becomes a sort of mini cult leader, and you see, and you want the vision that he has for this group of people who have gathered around him to be successful. He's not wrong. All of the ideas that he has about culture are not wrong, and yet I feel that he does this thing that we see so many times that charismatic men leaders do, which is they see a world they don't like, they decide to become separatists and create a world they like, and then they become just as tyrannical and oppressive as the world that they left behind.
Yeah.
And it's such a tired old story. It happens all the time. And so I wanted to know how he came to be, and how you felt in your heart toward him, as the story went on.
Yeah.
He's an incredible character. I mean, he could have been so one-dimensional, and there's not you're not capable of writing one-dimensional characters, but it's just, he's an amazing character.
Thank you. He was, and that was kind of the whole goal with him, you know, like I wanted there to be this guy who was sort of tyrannical and super sexist, right? Because he's also that. And very sexy, sort of almost like the sort of physical descriptions of him. He's almost really kind of impossible looking, right? Like he's sort of described as being one shade olive. He's this kind of amber lion colored man. And he's all, you know, he's really tall and never sweats. And he's he's sort of towing the line between it. He's a real person,
but
absolutely.
There are people who are like that. That's the thing.
True. I know, right?
That's why the world is so dangerous.
Exactly.
That's why these men are so dangerous.
These types of men, right?
These of men.
Types of men. But I also wanted him to be in sort of his revolutionary spirit. I think he's right about almost anything, almost all of it. Yeah. And so I wanted that kind of, that complication, and that sort of wanting to kind of almost sort of write him off entirely, but not quite being able to. And that's important, I think, because so far as I understand it, I think my job is to kind of is not to write the character that you can sort of very easily dismiss. It's to sort of write a character that you have to grapple with and you have to kind of tarry with for a while, because it's, you know, for really obvious reasons, you become more invested in a character like that than one that you can be like, oh yeah, that's just the bad guy. So there was that. And I think the other thing about Cass, you know, this book is set in the 80s, and the 80s is a really very particular time in Philadelphia, but it's also a very particular time, I think, around the world, and I'll limit it to America. we sort of come out of this sort of, not that the 60s and 70s were by any means utopic, but, you kind of come out of all these freedom movements, the women's rights movements and Black Power and the civil, and there's this sense afoot for a little while, I think, that something different is possible. Even though, there's violence, it's very fraught. And then it's 1980 and Ronald Reagan gets elected and the window just shuts. And that means a lot of things. It means that people are demoralized. It means that people are confused. It means that people are unmoored. It means a whole bunch of stuff. It means that people are disillusioned. And Cass, I always imagined, he's an ex-Black Panther. I imagine him as this guy who was genuinely disappointed, genuinely unmoored, genuinely disillusioned, genuinely a little bit bewildered by what the hell happened. We did all this stuff, and then what happened? How are we here? And so some of that sort of desire to make a new world is also, I think, fueled by this sense that all of these things that happened in the decade that preceded the events in the book, and they didn't work. And he's kind of heartbroken. Yeah. That's the thing, I think, beneath all of that, is that this man is also heartbroken and bereft. And which doesn't excuse the horrible ways that he is, because he's pretty bad and he's got a will to power like hell. I mean, you can't, but he's also heartbroken. So that kind of complication there, I think, is really important to him as a character. And it was very important for me in thinking about it. And it was also a place for me to kind of sneak in my kind of capital T thematics, you know what I mean? Because I wanted to think about the 80s as a decade after the 70s. And I wanted to think about what it meant that all of these Black Power movements and all these other movements had kind of been stopped so abruptly. And the world looked very different in the 1980s than it looked in the 1970s. And I wanted to think about that. Those are also the years in which I have my sort of preteen and teenage years. And I wanted to think about that. And I wanted to think about why it was like that and what the players were and the ways in which people would have been mourning something that they lost. And so he was a good place to kind of put some of that stuff.
That's an incredible way to frame that. And it makes me sort of admire his relentless insistence that, like, I'm still going to try to do something. I'm still going to try to make something. There's an idealism in him, and there is in Ava too. Mm-hmm. And although hers is not, I don't feel political, I feel that hers is personal. That there's something that she wants jubilance, she wants joy, she wants excitement, she wants life, vividness, and he's got that to offer. I also thought it was very, very smart writerly scheme of yours that when she left the man who was looking after her and her child, who was not a great guy, but how brilliant of you that he was also not an awful guy. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he's
just some dude.
He wasn't the worst.
Some guy.
Like, he wasn't the worst. Like, he had his stuff, but like, he was looking after them. Yeah. And she threw that away. And there's a moment
without agency. That was really, really important to me in thinking about all the characters in this book, and especially in my characters are, and they were in Hattie too, generally speaking, they're poor Black women. Yeah. And I'm not I was neither interested in the stereotype of the sort of super powerful woman who can bear anything, that's not a human being, right? Right. But nor was I interested in like narratives around poor people in which they're just sort of buffeted by economic forces and they don't have any agency and they don't make any choices, and they're
God knows honest.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah.
Where it's just like that's what's amazing about this book, is the things that happen to Ava are a combination of deep, centuries-long ancestral wrongs, cultural wrongs, racism, her own sort of bananas thinking, sexism, it's all in there. Yeah. And the result of it, and where our hearts break, is there's this kid who I want to get to, because I said in the beginning, I'm never going to forget this character, and I never will. This sensitive, watchful, thoughtful, You know, I was about to say frightened, but I don't think that that's necessarily the first word I would use to describe Toussaint. I think watchful would be the more because he does incredibly brave things. He's left. You know, there's a trope in children's stories that I'm sure you're aware of, but like for a good children's story to work, the kid has to be an orphan or neglected because an attentive parent would not let them go have an adventure, right? So like they're all, you know, they're all orphans. Like all the great children's characters and heroes are all orphans, or they've got like super checked out parents, like the kids, like Peter Pan and Wendy, like their parents are just off like socializing and they're not paying any attention. You have to have a parent who's not paying attention for a child to have adventure. And Toussaint has adventures. He has nightmares and he's not being fed and nobody's noticing that he's not going to school and he's not getting any of the care he needs, but he's also finding a world on his own, making friends with homeless guys who live in tent cities, learning a lot that maybe an 11-year-old shouldn't be learning, but you also get the sense he's going to be an extraordinary human being as a result of this unconventional upbringing. And just at every moment where I think something absolutely terrible is going to happen to him, he pulls out some sort of a resource, or there's some sort of like it's harrowing to read this, but I wondered if you could. I'm like, somebody take care of this kid, you know, but like something is taking care of this kid. Maybe it's Rhea back in the swamp in Bonaparte. I don't know, or Duchess, because there's a mystical connection between him and his grandmother. But like, how did you handle the terribly dangerous storytelling trope of child in danger? Because child in danger is heavy, and the stakes are really high.
Yeah. I think in part, so one thing I think that happens is that, you know, he hangs out with these homeless guys by these railroad tracks. One of them is this guy named Zeke, and one of the things that happens to Toussaint is that he discovers himself. He discovers things about himself that he's very proud of. Now, these are skills, again, that we might be like, well, but maybe an 11-year-old shouldn't know that, you know, but like he learns how he can like not be in school all day, and that he can drink, you know, he can drink coffee with lots of milk and sugar in it that's really hot, and have a honey bun, and it'll give him energy and it'll keep him warm. He can walk further and faster than he imagines. He learns that he's a listener, because all these guys always want to tell him all their horrible stories about all the things that have happened to him. And he's very proud of the fact that he can listen and he doesn't flinch. He discovers a certain kind of strength. So there's that. But I think also one of the things that I was interested in, I think, is like children who have adult problems, which he is, you know, and because I think sometimes, I think a lot about how we think about poor people in America. I think a lot, you know, and, you know, we've sort of said this thing about not wanting it to feel like people have agency. So that's a big part of it, right? Like this kid, even though he's a kid and is powerless by virtue of being a child to some extent, he also has agency. He makes decisions. They may be good, they may be bad, but he's making them.
Yeah.
And I was sort of thinking about the ways in which when people are very poor or when people are in trouble, there's this sense we have that everything that they are doing or finding out are things that are A, harmful to them, or B, sort of morally bad in some kind of way. And I sort of wanted to, I wanted to kind of draw some kind of complications around that. This kid's life isn't easy, but I don't know that we could necessarily also say that the things that he gets out of the difficulties of his life are things that are necessarily bad. You know, I think part of what we do a lot of times when people are poor is that we marginalize them, right? And it's just like, oh, they're living some kind of other crazy bad life that is, you know. But this kid, you know, he has moments of joy. He has moments of discovery. It's not easy, but he has them. And so I wanted to think, you know, as I thought about them, I was like, all right, yeah, he's in peril. Lots of kids are in peril. Not that that makes it okay, but it does make it a reality. And where is their complication in this peril? You know, it can't just be sort of like, oh, this kid's going around having bad things happen to him, you know, weep, weep. Like he's a person, which means
Yeah.
he's like growing and he's discovering stuff and he's having, you know, even though perhaps those things are not packaged in a way that we're used to, or in a way that makes things seem sort of like acceptable. You know, all these people, him included, are folks that are living on a kind of a margin.
Yeah.
And I wanted to think a lot about how in the margins there are also things that are extraordinary and beautiful and strange and lyrical and all of these sorts of things. Like I didn't want some long, endless, sad song. I wanted something else. Like a blues song, a little bit. Kind of like, you know, I'm as good as any woman in your town. You know, I mean, I know that Toussaint's not, you know, he's a kid, but these things about itinerant women hopping trains and the songs that those women sing, sometimes they're sad about not having food and getting beat up by your man, but they're also like things like, I'm as good as any woman in your town. You know, there's agency, there's pride, there's joy. So I was interested in all that too.
And there's a radiance, you know, that's the thing that I kept circling and finding again. It's not just with Cass. You know, other characters are also described as you know, having energy that comes off them in gold sparks or being gilded. There's this character, a street woman named Clea, an incredible appearance by this woman. I mean,
it's
any
Oscar
actor,
worthy. She also
any actor
would want this lady come from.
Any actor would want to play this part. Oh my God, she just shows up in a dark tunnel in Philadelphia. She's terrifying. She's mythical, and you write of her that she's terrifying, but something glowed a little in her, just a scintilla of light, like she might be silver underneath if you rubbed hard enough. And I underlined that line like 3 times because I felt like, but that's everybody in this book, right? Like everybody in this book, there's this gleaming radiance and power and beauty that's just beneath the surface of the hardship. And the interesting thing is what's rubbing hard enough at them to let that light be shown is actually the circumstances of their lives. Like that's what's bringing the gleam out, you know, like as you were saying about Toussaint, what he finds about himself. And you write about that too with Ava. When she was a child, you use a similar kind of language saying she was colder and wetter than was bearable, but she found out that she could bear it. She found out. There's a bunch of times where these children find out that they're really stronger than they thought, you know, and I feel like that's the sort of rub that's happening. That's like that's like showing the gleam underneath, and as a reader and as a human, you don't want them to miss out on the hardships that are going to bring them to that gleam, you know, to that scintilla of silver. It's really, I know I'm really focusing a lot on the characters and we haven't really gotten to the story, but these characters are just extraordinarily well done. You know, they're amazing. They're so incredible. You're such an incredible writer.
Oh,
I know you know this, but you really are.
Thank you. You know, I think there's a lot of, not directly, but there's a lot of sort of aspects of my life in this book. My very young life. And I think one of the things that sort of means most, you know, people will say kind of like, if you were to describe yourself, what would you say? And I would say, with great pride, I would say I'm a poor Black girl from Philly. Like that's who, you know, and that's my economic circumstances are changed. I have a lot more, you know, but that to me is a statement of not just identity. It's a statement about aesthetics. It's a statement about what I think is beautiful. It's a statement about how I kind of fundamentally understand the world. It's a statement about how I understand people. And so I think it's really, there's so much of, and that is informed by having had a childhood and adolescent years that were dicey and difficult in some ways. And that though I would not want to relive them, I don't think I would trade them at all.
And you wouldn't, I'm guessing, wish it on anyone. No. And yet without it, you can't be who you have to be.
Right. exactly. And
And
I
that's
think
the
that
great
that's true
mystery.
of
Yeah.
everyone, right? It's like you can think about the things that formed you, and you can look at them with bitterness or shame. Shame is a big one,
Yeah.
right? Shame. Um, and or as the time passes, you can look at them as not a gift, because I think that's a little Pollyanna, but what you can think is that these, I would not be myself if these things hadn't happened, and I would not love the way I love, and I wouldn't have been loved the way that I was loved if these things hadn't happened.
Right.
They shape you, and in a certain sort of sense, in the long run, it isn't so much that they're gifts, they're just sort of what is. They're the isness of you. And so if you're going to accept yourself at some point, all those things that are part of your isness,
Yeah.
there they are.
I have a friend who says about that exact conundrum, the things that have shaped you the most were probably the very worst things that happened to you. You would not want them to happen to anyone. You don't look back on them with nostalgia, but yet you wouldn't be who you are without them. And he always says, in conclusion, something very interesting is happening here. And I think that's the only conclusion here in the cosmos. Something very interesting is happening here. I don't know how this works, but it is interesting. Like something very interesting. In conclusion, we can assume. Speaking of interesting things that happen in this book, there's something. It took me a minute to kind of be able to put words on it, but in many ways, this book is about the failure of the Great Migration to the North. I mean, it's not about that. I mean, you very lightly weave huge themes into your work, but the very fact that this book begins with a young Black man in Philadelphia desperate to get on a bus to go to Alabama to be saved is an indicator that perhaps our ideas about like what part of the country have done well for Black people are a little bit, it's not the typical story that we're accustomed to of flight, desperate flight for safety. And I found it fascinating that if there is a utopia described in this book, it's in Alabama, it's in the South, it's where Dutchess lives on this what is remaining of these 10,000 acres of land that were owned by free Black people, who defended that land and created essentially communal government and communal marketplace and exactly everything that Cass, the former Black Panther, is trying to do in this urban setting in Philadelphia, sort of organically and intuitively and sort of mystically. Sorry, my glasses are broken and that's why they keep falling. I'm a wreck. My glasses are held together by duct tape. I've got bronchitis, but I'm awfully excited about this book. Everything that they're trying to create in Philadelphia, Dutchess and these very old, this tiny little surviving group of old Black people in the Deep South have held on to and created, and it has become a kind of a mecca, a promised land. Certainly for Toussaint and a little bit for Ava, but certainly for Toussaint, that if he can just get there to rural Alabama, he's going to be all right. And we as the readers also feel that he's going to be all right. And I want to just speak to the irony of that and to culturally how you came up with that complete reversal of the story that we're used to of like fleeing south. It's like, no, don't go south. Like, don't go south. Don't go to Alabama. Like, but it's no, the North isn't working, but something back in the South is. And what is your own lived experience of that? What was the inspiration for you for the town of Bonaparte? Tell me more about how that came to be.
Yeah. So as I said, we're 100 years in Philadelphia. Both of my grandparents are from Virginia. And I sort of seem to have this kind of great migration obsession a little bit. I mean, there's so much in the first book, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, like a lot about kind of a first generation of great migrants, basically. And so then we fast forward, 50 or 60 years from when that book begins into the 80s. And, there's the disillusionment we were talking about in the 70s and 80s and all this kind of stuff. And there's this sense that there's a sense that the sort of urban roots of trying to do this stuff somehow haven't worked. And there's also a sense of, well, what could create autonomy in a wider system that is not interested in you being alive, really? You know what I mean? Or you having any sort of agency and that kind of thing. And the answer I think these characters come up with is land. I think that, and in fact, the sort of real story, if there's the kind of corollary, you know, in the United States around 1910, Black landowners, a lot of it built during, like owned during or bought during the Reconstruction right after the Civil War, owned many billions of acres of land. And by 1997, something like 92% of that land was gone, at a loss of roughly, conservatively, 326 billion with a B dollars. Land lost to tax stuff, to theft, to lynching, to intimidation, to eminent domain, all sorts of things.
Right.
And so one of the big questions I think that I was thinking about was, well, what would it look like if that land, what if people have retained that land? And not just what does it look like in terms of like wealth and that sort of stuff, which is a big question, of course, but like, what does it look like psychically? What does it look like if you are a kind of a group of people who the larger group of people have sort of been like, oh, we kind of don't want you here. What are we going to do with you? I've been reading all these Lincoln letters. Forgive me. I'm going to try not to go on a tangent there. But one of the big questions coming out of the Civil War was like, what do we do with these Black people? You know, like, but before it was like, well, are we going to emancipate the slaves? We're not going to emancipate the slaves. And it was like, well, are we going to? But then what are we going to do with them? We don't want them here. But of course, Black people stay, you know. So these are very old questions. And one of the answers to the sort of how do you survive in a situation like that is if there's a piece of land. And there aren't a lot of pieces of land to be had in the North, you know, but there are in the South. But it's interesting. I'm also not necessarily making the argument that the Great Migration is a failed experiment exactly. But I think what I am trying to say is that there is more than one way to look at this whole thing. And that narrative around the promised land of the North is overly simplistic. It certainly sort of didn't turn out the way that folks had hoped that it would turn out.
Yeah.
And then at the same time that wasn't working, there were these places, extant places now even in the South, that were these all Black communities, you know, Mound Bayou, which still exists, is one. Eatonville, for readers of Zora Neale Hurston, she spent a lot of her life there, her young life there. It's in Florida. And Their Eyes Are Watching God is set there. So there are these sort of Black places that protected people in a certain sense from things like Jim Crow, or the sort of extreme violence of Jim Crow, because you could kind of remove yourself from the system. It didn't mean that you were safe, but you were safer.
Yeah.
So all of those kinds of things were things that I was thinking about in trying to kind of understand the North-South thing. Because frankly, I don't really understand it. You know, like, I'm very, very Northern. I don't really, there's a lot of things about the United States and the trajectory of Black and Native people in this country that I don't understand. I could rattle off a bunch of facts, but I don't really understand. And so in some ways, books for me are a way of raising a lot of questions, the answers to which I don't necessarily have. But what I'm trying to do, I suppose, in a way, is to keep asking these questions in more and more nuanced ways, even though the answer I don't know. And that seems like a very good question, which is a basic question about where could one attempt to feel safe?
Yeah.
What would it cost you to try to do that? What does it look like? Those kinds of questions, I think, were things that I was really interested in. This whole situation about land, and I know this answer is getting long. One last thing I'll say.
This is so important. Keep talking. I'm not going to hang up on you. I'm taking this all in. It's fascinating. Go.
So, you know, I talked about sort of land and Black land loss and all of which is very true and real. And for folks who are listening, it is quite something. And the fact of that land loss really so much changed the trajectory for so many Black people in this country. But you know, my own family, my on my grandfather's side, my grandfather's father was a blacksmith in Virginia, late 19th century, early 20th century. And he was a very successful blacksmith. And he became such a successful blacksmith that in some ways he began to be seen as a threat to white business owners in the area. So they had a big parcel of land. He had his smithy. And essentially what happened was that the white landowners and locals near where they lived, which was near Lynchburg, Virginia, they basically ran him off the land. And that's how my family ended up in Philadelphia. And they ran him off the land. They didn't buy the land. They didn't. So that land was lost to our family.
Right.
And so the Unsettled isn't that story, of course, exactly. But it is a kind of.
But it is too.
It's a rumination.
Yeah.
Like what does it mean to lose something? And the wonderful thing in this case with these folks is that, at least in part in Bonaparte, the amount of land, it was 10,000 acres. It's dwindled enormously. But these folks were able to hold on to it at great cost. And there's a lot of questions. It is unsettled, you know, like what will happen to the land and what will happen to the people. But I guess it's almost in a certain way from a sort of personal kind of emotional heart space. I was interested in thinking about what would it look like if some folks held their land. What would the cost be of keeping it? What would the cost be of leaving it? And what if you left it voluntarily? Like back to this sort of sense of agency, right? Like Ava leaves. Nobody makes her leave. I mean, a lot of dicey stuff happened. So in some ways, perhaps emotionally, she sort of had to leave. But she wasn't run off it. Yeah. She makes a choice. And then she forever mourns the choice. You know, part of the caste stuff is that, you know, she came from this free Black place, which in the United States, most Black people don't have the experience of being free. And they also don't have the experience of being not a minority. She has had that experience. Right. It's huge. It's unprecedented. She can't remake it. And even though that is not expressly what she says she's looking for, the sort of grand, larger than life of that reality is also what she's looking for, you know? And so she sort of ends up in a kind of dark mirror of this lovely place that she came from. Now stop talking.
Wow, I see it. Okay, yeah. It's amazing. I just want to commend you because you know, as you write nonfiction too. You know, you write essays, you write about class, you write about race. You know, you're a great journalist, a great public thinker. You know, there are so many ways you can address this as a creative person. Like, do you write a giant nonfiction book about this? Right. Do you write 1,000 essays for the New York Times about this? You know, or do you spend years dreaming and creating a novel that actually tells the story in a more searing way than I think nonfiction can? And I feel like that's what you've done twice. And it's hard enough to do it once. And it's very hard to do it the second time when the world is demanding to know where your second book is coming. And really, the fact that you were able, in the crucible of that attention, to create a book this thoughtful, this funny, this vivid, and human and unforgettable is a real gift.
Thank you. It's I feel like it's the sort of the gift of the form, you know. I mean, you could write 1,000, and I will, you know, and they always, I just feel like I'm talking about the same thing, just like in different ways, you know. But there's something very particular about sort of being able to, forgive the use of the word, sojourn or tarry with some folks. Like, and that's what fiction is, right? Like, we're going to tarry with these people in their travail, you know, and also in their triumph. And there's not really a way to say that exactly in that way in nonfiction, right?
No, there isn't.
Fiction is just like, to the extent that I am able, with its limits, I can show you, you know, I can show you what this looks like.
What you can't do in nonfiction is just the scintilla of gold, the gleam, the magic, the mysticism, that just tiny touch of the unreal, that and the mythical, that you blend into this extremely real book, and that makes it truly a work of art and not just a work of social science. And that's what I think only novels can do.
Only novels can do it.
You know,
Yeah.
and it's not easily done. And for all the people who are demanding all those years where your second book was, I just want to say, if any of you people think that it is easy to do this, if any of you think that it is easy to write a book like this, I would suggest you go try. But there is only one person who could write this book, and it was you. And I wish I had so many more hours to talk to you. And I know that we have intersecting people in our lives, and my hope is that someday we'll be able to sit in person, because you're such a captivating speaker and thinker as well as a writer. And I feel so honored that you came and joined us. And I wish I've got like 30 more pages of questions for you, and so I'm going to save them. Or maybe we can do this conversation live on stage someday. But I just want to, and also writer to writer, as somebody who had a big, wildly successful book and then had the world say, "What are you going to do next?" You nailed it. You nailed it. And that could not have been easily done. So everybody, if you have not yet gotten Ayana Mathis's new book, which is now in paperback, please let us see the gorgeous paperback. Please read The Unsettled. It's a book for the ages. It truly is, and it's a great honor to know you. And from all of us, thank you for coming on the Onward Book Club.
It is a great honor to meet you and to talk with you, and for your enthusiasm and so much light. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for talking with me.
We love you, and we'll see you next time.
Yes.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.